Welcome, symposium attendees. I hope you're enjoying your morning thus far. We have in the audience a mix of communication professionals, aspiring communication professionals, and our students and researchers in the audience. Think of us as just sitting side by side one another, right? If we were in person. All heightened interest to hear discussion on a very important issue today, cannabis, within the context of communication. And we couldn't have assembled a better panel to discuss seed to sell PR in the cannabis industry. And when I was thinking about the panel in preparation, I was really reminded of so many times where clients would come to us at we, formerly known as Wagner, with issues that we couldn't really solve using communication objectives or strategies, which really happens often. But the cannabis industry is uniquely positioned in the marketplace, right? It's affecting so many different stakeholders in different ways, perceived and misperceived in so many different ways, which really lends itself to be the perfect communication issue that can bring these stakeholders together with communication objectives and strategies to find mutual understanding. And that's really what PR is all about, finding mutual understanding. And so whether that's navigating the inconsistent legalities of cannabis use on a federal or state level, the ethical issues of medicinal use, the media representations of cannabis, exposure to advertising, increasing use among youth, cannabis touches us in different ways. So it requires a broad conversation from experts. So it really is my honor to moderate as an assistant professor at the Murrow College and welcome such an esteemed panel today. What I'd like to do is first introduce our four panelists and experts, and then we'll start our cannabis conversation. We will save roughly 10 to 15 minutes at the end to answer any of your questions that you may have. So be sure to place your comments in the Attendify chat, and we'll be sure to get to those as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome my colleague, good friend, Dr. Stacey Hust. She is an associate professor of communication and associate dean of faculty affairs and college operations in the Edward R. Murrow College. She is nationally recognized and ranked by the Communication Institute for Online Scholarship for her health communication research focused on substance abuse prevention. Her research has been sponsored by the United States Department of Education, the Washington State Division of Alcohol and Substance Abuse, and Washington State Alcohol and Drug Abuse Research Program. Welcome, Dr. Hust. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Jessica Willoughby. She's an associate professor in the Murrow College. Her research focuses on how the media can have a positive impact on health. She examines the potential for communication strategies to improve adolescent and young adult health and the processes through which media impacts health outcomes as a precursor to intervention. Dr. Willoughby, welcome. And I'd like to welcome Beth Aden. Beth is a marketing director, cannabis communication expert. She has been in PR, marketing, and branding since 2011 and has an extensive background in targeted media outreach, including the cannabis, hemp, CBD, and psychedelic industries. She is also the founder and editor of Tank.org, which has been providing cannabis industry commentary since 2014. Welcome, Beth. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Bess Byers, who is also known as, and I love this, all of you will love this as well, Cannabis. She has 10 years of digital marketing experience, with 6 of those years in the legal cannabis industry. She is the founder of Blaise Creative, which specializes in content creation, social media management, web development, SEO, email marketing. And as she puts it, her degree in public relations is now being utilized to market her favorite flower. So welcome, Bess. Great to have you all here. Welcome. And thank you for your time today. You know, as the industry has evolved over the years, we've referred to cannabis in so many different ways: weed, pot, marijuana. And with that evolution, let's start off our panel by asking our experts, you know, more broadly, what's one thing that our audience might not know about the cannabis culture in its evolution? Where are we today? And I'll throw it to Dr. Hust to kick us off.
Oh, goodness. Well, thanks, Liz. Well, across the country, states have legalized recreational marijuana use, cannabis use, pardon me. And with that has been a growth and actually a boon in the industry to market these products. And with that growth in advertising has come somewhat of a struggle among states to try to figure out how to regulate that advertising while still managing the commercial speech interests of the retailers and the producers of the products.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Dr. Willoughby, what do you think about that?
Thank you so much, Liz. So I think the other thing too that we can think about is that we see popular culture talking a lot more about cannabis as it's been legalized. We're seeing individuals posting on their own social media accounts, making their own memes. Content creation is really popular here. And so I think there's a whole culture around it, especially that some of these younger audiences have become a part of.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Good. And younger audiences, let's shoot it to Beth and Bess. What do you think about that in the evolution of cannabis culture?
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I have 2 goddaughters who are 6 and 7. And so for as long as they've been alive, you know, to them, I've just been working with plants, and it's really all in how you communicate it to kids. You know, they understand that it's a product for adults. They also understand that it's a product that kids use who are sick. You know, because parents are turning to cannabis as alternative medicine. You know, one of my clients, his dad had stage 4 thyroid cancer, didn't want to go through chemo, switched to an alkaline diet and only ate Rick Simpson oil. And he's been cancer free for 8 years. So I really think that we need to, you know, think about how we're presenting this. You know, it's not like it's a product that people are just using like with alcohol to get drunk. You know, this is a plant that has a lot of healing benefits. And so how do you communicate those to people? You know, I like to smoke weed and exercise. So, you know, so it's like using that plant to enhance experiences versus using it as something that's intoxicating. You know, I think with children and advertising, you know, you have a lot of potential to shift it to something positive for adults going forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Beth, what do you think?
Oh, thank you, Liz. Yeah, I think Bess makes a really good point. I think it's important to remember that we're not looking at propaganda as we were, you know, 10, 15 years ago, where there was a type of cannabis consumer that was vilified. Cannabis consumers come in all shapes and sizes and all ages. And it's important to know that, you know, it could be your neighbor, it could be your mom, it could be your friend, it could be you. Every person is different and uses it for a different reason. And these segments of populations are growing and changing in terms of who the consumer is. So when you're marketing and speaking to these consumers, you have to think about them as human beings and not just segments of populations. Like baby boomers are the fastest growing segment of cannabis users, and they've been overlooked for most of cannabis's history in terms of marketing a product. So I think just looking at it as a holistic thing that, you know, every people of all walks and shapes of life can enjoy.
Mm-hmm. So each of you has mentioned the growth, the boon, legalization, plants used when you're sick, a holistic approach, right? So for those in the industry right now, how would you define cannabis culture today? Then how would we describe that, Beth and Bess?
I mean, I would say it's changing. It's like you're seeing, moms who are coming out of the cannabis closet. Like Beth said, elderly. One of the shops that I work with, they did a guided shopping for seniors monthly discussion pre-COVID, really to help that elderly population look at alternatives to pharmaceuticals. You have the hiking community, the outdoors, lots of people are coming out of the cannabis closet. It's not like Beth said, the person who's smoking weed in their basement and is like dirty and dingy. It's like, it's the doctors, the lawyers, the politicians, your grandparents, your neighbor, probably your kid's teacher. It's so much more than just getting high. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah, I think we can look toward the marketing to really see like who these people are. Brands are kind of deciding who their target consumer is, what aspects of life they want to help, add to. So it could be, relax or chill or focus. They're seeing these effects-based products coming out of the woodwork to really address needs in people's lives. And I think that any part of your life can need a different type of product. So, maybe in the afternoon you want a chill, maybe in the morning you want to focus. So I think that any one consumer can really be anyone's consumer, just based on what type of need they're trying to fill, what time of day it is, what day of the week.
Okay, good. So now as audience members and as panelists, we've kind of set the groundwork here, right? We've created common ground that today cannabis culture is really seen as for everyone. It's holistic, it's attainable, and it can be used in a variety of different ways, right? And, Beth, you mentioned kind of all about the importance of marketing here. So is it the repositioning of marijuana to CBD, focusing on CBD versus THC that's kind of helped that repositioning of the cannabis culture, do you think?
I would say that's a major factor. It seems that the health and wellness aspect is a easier in for a lot of people to understand the benefits of cannabis. If you go up to someone and say, hey, do you want to get high? They're probably not going to say yes to you. But if you're talking about, this specific CBD product helps me with, my ankle injury, or it helps me calm down during an anxious or stressful day, I think that's something that people can relate to, and they really want to see if that helps with their lives. And then the stories of seeing it being used as medicine, like Bess mentioned, children using CBD to help stop from seizures. I think that's just something that touches people's heart, and they helps them understand, what this plant is really doing and how it's affecting people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Good.
One thing that I'd like to chime in about that too is, it's not just the CBD. And I think that with marketing and communication, we do have the power to share that story, because, when you are having seizures, when you are in pain, the THC is just as important as the CBD from a medical perspective, from a health and wellness perspective. So starting to shift that conversation of, it's not just the CBD, it is the THC, and the THC isn't about just getting high. It also is just as important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, we're talking about branding here. Oh, Dr. Hust, did you want?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump and clarify a little bit in terms of the culture and what the consumer culture really means. I think part of it that's an important distinction to make here is adolescents and children using it for health benefits with a medical professional, with guidance from their parents, adolescents using it for non-medical benefits. And I think it's important to note it's actually illegal for adolescents, especially in the state of Washington and most states, to use it. There has been very, the field is sort of uncertain as to how it affects them. But some research has come out to show that it could have potentially harmful effects to adolescent brains, especially because adolescent brains are developing. And so I think it's important to understand that there's not a lot known about how cannabis affects the human brain at this time, and that legally it's not legal for adolescents to use. And I think that's an important distinction. So Jessica and I's work focuses primarily on adolescents' exposure to marijuana advertisements and to marijuana content, and whether or not that's going to affect their intentions to use. And I think an important distinction to make between that area of work and then the area of work of marketing to responsible adults to make a decision for themselves in states where it's been legalized for someone over the age of 21.
Mhm. Dr. Hust, you make such an important point. I'm glad that you jumped in there, because as we think about um, our audience, many people are PR practitioners or aspiring to be PR practitioners, and the importance of diversity of thought in kind of this space. Um, can someone successfully tell the story of cannabis at an agency for brands if they're not a user, or if they haven't really dived into the research or really understood the research? So I open this up to all of the panelists. Really, what's the responsibility of PR firms, agencies, in making sure that all those voices are included when you're trying to brand for a cannabis company or client?
Well, I think it's very important that you have a diverse opinions within a business making marketing decisions. I think that that is definitely crucial. You get to see different perspectives and different populations giving their thoughts, because not every person is going to come to the same conclusions when they see a marketing message. That also speaks to the difficulties of marketing within cannabis. There's all kinds of legal repercussions to think about. You have to think about compliance from every aspect, going all the way to marketing. So those messages that are reaching the end user, a lot of the times they have to be run by a company's legal department, make sure that you're not breaking any sort of laws, because it is still federally illegal. So that's all very important to think about. But I do think that you can tell the story of cannabis without being a user. I just think that you need to fully research and make sure that you know the history of the plant and where it's been. How we've gotten to this point is as crucial as making sure that you're following compliance today.
Bess, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it helps to know the product and to be consuming it. Similar if you were to market alcohol, and you're having to write copy about the taste of a whiskey or, a wine, it helps to consume the product, to know exactly what it is you're writing about. And similar to what Beth said as well, there are a lot of regulations when it comes even down to like your logo design, all of your marketing, not all of it, but a lot of your, your package design, that kind of thing does have to get run through state cannabis agencies. So in Washington, we have the Liquor and Cannabis Board. So that way you're having products that don't appeal to children. And I know the state, there have been certain regulations where they wanted to regulate packaging colors, brand names. We can't use terms like gummies. So there are certain things that you have to be aware of. And they're always changing. The laws are always changing. So you have to be on top of it.
Well, let's talk about that control of the message, right? I'm interested to hear what Stacey and Jessica think about this. What are your views on how media positions cannabis use? There's only so much that we as marketers, communicators can do to position those brands and the industry at large. How do you feel about the media and its position of cannabis use? Is this incongruent with the realities of cannabis culture? Who controls this narrative?
Liz, I think that's a great question. I don't think there's a homogenous cannabis culture that's presented by the media. I think there's a lot of confusion around cannabis and how we talk about cannabis. And I think we see that in the messages we get from marketers, the messages we get from entertainment media and Hollywood are very different, right? And so I think as the field and as the industry grows and as it matures, I think we'll begin to see distinctions in those messages. So we won't see the stigmatized, demonized user. We will see individuals who are using it for health benefits or who are choosing to use it as adults because they want to and because it's legal and they can. And then we will have also healthy conversations around when it is or isn't appropriate for someone to start using cannabis and its potential health effects. But I think we're a ways off from there because there's still so much uncertainty around cannabis. And in part, that uncertainty is because of the limitations put on cannabis research because it is still federally illegal. And there's not as much research as can be done or has been done in other countries because legally in the United States, You have to jump through a ton of hoops in order to study cannabis effects. And as those regulations begin to be a little bit more relaxed, I think we'll learn more about how cannabis affects the human body in both healthy and harmful ways.
Mhm, mhm.
I'd also just add to that, that I think that what we're also seeing is that this portrayal and the understanding, especially that adolescents and young adults have about cannabis, is shifting along with the changes in the industry. So even the portrayals that we might have seen 10 years ago are very different than what we might be seeing today. But that doesn't mean they're completely gone. In some of the data that Stacey and I collected with adolescents and young adults, we actually found that about 70% of the adolescents and the young adults still said that they were seeing posts on social media about marijuana users being losers, or kind of that more stoner type movie from back in the day, right? That might have been a very different perspective than the marketing that's currently happening is going on. At the same time, they're also noting that they're seeing positive portrayals. They're talking about how they've above 80% of adolescents and young adults had seen portrayals where celebrities had talked about it in a positive way or linked a song to something positive about cannabis. And so it's really like moving in that direction, it seems, kind of like Stacey mentioned, where we're seeing more of the every person who could be a user, more of that information out there. But those other stereotypes still seem to exist and at least be prevalent in some of the media that they're seeing.
Mhm, mhm. And based on your findings, based on your research, that regular exposure to marijuana advertising increases the likelihood for adolescent marijuana use. What is the corporate social responsibility of cannabis companies to kind of interject and help change that position?
So I think it's important to note our research has found that exposure to cannabis advertising is linked to, or at least associated with youth's intentions to use the drug, right? But that's also true and has been found of alcohol advertising. It was true of tobacco advertising. The goal of advertising is to get people to use your product. So a good advertisement is going to encourage all ages to use the product, right? So from the marketer's perspective, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. I think the other aspect of this is that the cannabis industry could follow the alcohol industry's efforts in which the alcohol industry developed the distilled, pardon me, I'm going to look at my notes here. The Distilled Spirits Council of the United States is used to help identify how liquor advertisements are supposed to be portrayed and what kind of appeals they use, whether or not they can sexually objectify women, for example, or link alcohol to sexual activity. We don't have something similar currently for cannabis advertisements. And I think that if the industry is going to be more responsible, especially to its adolescent viewers, it will create such a code of responsible advertising practices. So that there is a little bit of responsibility for the potential that adolescents are seeing in their ads and that adolescents may want to use based on their advertisements.
Mhm, mhm.
I would just also add briefly that I think kind of both, as Bess and Beth mentioned, right, there's a lot out there that's scientific and unknown and being discovered still about cannabis and how it can be used and what it's being used for. And I think that also puts pressure not only on marketers, but on the audience to really understand that, right? It's a form of science communication in a way so that they can really understand the risks or benefits to them, what they can experience from that. And I think that can be tricky, especially with adolescents, and how to best do that. So we've seen some too where the alcohol industry had previously done, corporate social responsibility type campaigns, drinking and driving at the holidays, for example, campaigns dissuading that. I think those sorts of things could end up playing a role in the future, especially as organizations figure out more about how they want to position it and young people figure out what they need to know to make decisions as they become older and become consumers who can make choices for themselves in that range.
And oh, sorry, Liz, I would just jump in and add to Dr. Willoughby's statement that part of this is also on the responsibility of parents, the responsibility of educators, right? So helping adolescents be able to be media literate and understand the advertising techniques that are used to sell all types of products is really critical here. And so I think it's not, the onus is not just on the industry, it's on society as a whole to help adolescents be able to, when they see the ads, to be critical of them and to ask questions that may help them make a decision that's right for them within their family values and within, their own health and wellness.
Yeah, and Stacey, I would extend that even to marketers too. I think that it's also on marketers to make those informed decisions and be media literate themselves, thinking about how those messages could be perceived. I know you taught me that back in Murrow in like 2012. And I think about that every time I release something. I'm like, is this going to be received well? Are there any sort of issues that could arise? And I think that's even more important in cannabis, where you should be second guessing everything you publish.
Mhm.
It's an excellent point, Beth. Very excellent point.
So I was curious as to how the user plays a role in kind of cannabis culture and drug reform. And you answered it in that it's important for them to be literate, media literate, find that information. What else can users do to play a significant role in kind of the direction of where that industry goes?
I would say shop with your dollars. I think if you are, speaking with bud tenders who are giving you information about a product and maybe its values or, things that it's doing to better society. Maybe it has a recycling program, or it plants trees or donates to a dog shelter. I've seen all of those examples with companies in Washington. If those are things that are important to you, I would encourage, purchasing those products and writing to the companies and letting them know that you care about that. Be an informed consumer and tell the companies what you want, because especially in this new industry, they are listening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Bess, did you want to add to that?
Oh gosh, no, that's a great point. I guess too, the other thing that's, that's important to note is, with marketing and advertising, there's regulations about what sort of like medical claims that you can make as a brand. So that's something to definitely take into consideration. Oh gosh, I don't know. Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, Bess, I think you really nailed it on the head. I think it's important that to understand the regulations, to understand the effects, to shop with particular vendors, to become literate in all aspects of the industry. I'd like to transition just briefly, talk a little bit about the fact that U.S. cannabis sales have hit really $17.5 billion within the last year. It's a significant increase. I'd like to talk about how social media influencers has played a role in repositioning cannabis use. And how are you utilizing those influencers as you help brand for clients or your own brand as well?
Yeah, well, social media influencing kind of started, especially in the cannabis space, maybe 5-6 years ago. And part of that is because companies like Google, we can't pay for advertising. We can't do Google AdWords. We can't, sponsor YouTube content. Same thing with Facebook, Instagram, we can't sponsor posts. So with social influencing, what it became is people just speaking organically about products and talking about brands, and brands started to discover this is a great way to get the word out. From an agency perspective, I own a cannabis marketing agency, but I also do have my own influencing page. And so it's interesting to be on both sides of that. For an agency, we'll work with clients to manage their influencer campaigns. So we go out, connect with influencers, aim to get, as much following and reach and engagement as possible, and get people to organically talk about products. And I think it's so wonderful because for me, I personally don't like big tech. They censor cannabis. They've deleted my account, multiple times. So why would I want to give them my ad dollars? So it's wonderful to go and find other creatives who are willing to speak organically and authentically. And it's a really new way of marketing, not just cannabis, but all kinds of products. I don't know if the comm school talks about the power of social influencing marketing, but it's huge.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. To follow up, Bess, I'd like to ask you, as far as marketing the health benefits of cannabis and people who are organically talking about it, what can and can't you say in marketing content?
Yeah. So for example, as a client, as a brand in Washington State, we legally can't make medical claims. So for example, the farm I work with, we can't be like, our RSO will cure your cancer. But what we can do is share a firsthand story. And when we talk about, this, we got into the industry because, we wanted to make RSO for our owner's dad. Once you start sharing those stories, lots of other people share their own stories. you can't really how can you tell someone their firsthand account with a plant is illegal? That's their experience with it. And so that's kind of where the fine line is like, you can't make medical claims, but you can share personal stories. The other thing that's interesting is, cannabis is a bronchial dilator. So it helps open your airways. So, we can't say, oh, our weed will make you breathe faster when you go run, but we can share that this, the cannabinoid system studies have found X, Y, and Z. So it's a fine line you walk.
No, certainly. Stacey and Jessica, are you finding that in your research about how health claims are marketed and how that's affecting some of the audiences?
I would say we haven't looked a lot at health claims ourselves, and so I can't really speak to what we've seen in terms of health claims. We know that there are, like Bess mentioned, legal restrictions around what can and can't be said, especially in different areas. It's not really a coordinated effort yet, over the nation, because different states legalize in different ways and have different restrictions in place around some of that. We do know that from other research and communication that testimonials can be really powerful. And so I think the potential that that's still out there, people can hear stories, can certainly have an impact on individuals, just as Bess mentioned, right? When you hear a story, you see what someone went through or experienced, that can be really emotion evoking for people sometimes. And we know that emotions can also be a powerful way to get people to engage with products, behaviors, things like that.
And Jessica, you mentioned, Stacey, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Liz. I was just going to add that I think because they can be so powerful, it speaks for the need even more so to have people be able to understand those testimonials and understand the research in which they're based, right? And I think right now, many people are just really confused about how cannabis can affect one's health and both the pros and the negatives to cannabis. And so I think the audience really needs to be educated and be able to see themselves and make decisions for themselves. And I'm talking here solely for adults, right? So they can make informed decisions.
Yeah, you make a good point, Stacey, because for the journalists in the audience, thinking about science communication, science journalism, and how they report on research is really important. So there's a burgeoning area for you aspiring communicators to really become a smart, astute reporter of research, right? And making sure that you are communicating claims appropriately and the findings in a right way. You have an ethical responsibility for that. So thanks for mentioning that, Stacey.
Yeah.
Jessica mentioned coordinated effort, and that there really isn't much of a coordinated effort, right? We've seen kind of the inconsistencies across the country as well. And so I'd like to ask all of you really, who are the key partners or coalitions needed in the cannabis industry? And perhaps we start with the marketing folks first, in that does the bud tender play a role in this? Who are those key partnerships? Who are the key lawmakers? Who are the policymakers? Part in building a coalition to help this cannabis culture along?
Yeah, I think that the association that Stacey mentioned that alcohol has that cannabis needs, I think that would be a great thing to have, and it would actually take a lot of stress off of the brands who are trying to figure out how to market their products legally, and within regulation. I think having some sort of agency that you could submit to would be really helpful there. We do have just organizations within the industry for marketing. There's the Cannabis Marketing Association that does summits and events where we talk about similar issues to this and just kind of learn from each other and share experiences. In terms of regulation, there's NORML that's been active for decades, that's really been instrumental in helping with legalizing in many different states. We have, MAPS. There's all kinds of different organizations that are all separate. They work together a little bit, but we don't have any sort of overarching national organization like a lot of other industries do.
For those in the audience who may be branding right now for the industry. Who are key players in the state of Washington that you think are really important in influencing policy? Are there any key names that we can share with the audience who have been really vocal?
Oh gosh, well, we have lobbying organizations in Washington State as well. We have the Washington Sun Growers Association that advocates on behalf of sun-grown farms. We have the WACA, Washington Association of Cannabis. It's WACA. There's also a retail organization to lobby on behalf of the retail outlets. But yeah, similar to what Beth said, I don't know if we have like a nationwide organization, but it is important because I know, for example, last year, the state went to push through a bunch of legislation, and with the cannabis stuff, it was all within the first week of the legislative session. And so, luckily the community was really on top of it. But if, they hadn't been, they were going to push some really bad bills through. So
key opportunity there, right, in the marketplace for this association. For anyone in the audience right now wanting to kind of lead the charge on building a universal association for the cannabis culture, I think there is an opportunity there. I'm interested about what are those untapped segments in the industry that you'd like to explore? Is there anything that we have yet to uncover?
I think there's a lot still to uncover. I mean, I would love to see there be changes in legislation so that you can talk more openly and discuss more of the medical benefits, because I think it would appeal to the more senior customer. I think, similar to what we've talked about before, they're a huge segment that is really untapped. Both my grandparents now are using this plant for, medical benefits. And so I think that once that shift happens, it's going to be really interesting, especially with big pharma and, just shifting there too. So.
Good. Yeah. Big pharma. I hadn't thought about that.
Which we don't want, but that's
right.
Yeah.
Beth, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that there's, boundless untapped potential for innovation within the cannabis industry, but I'd really like to see a lot more depth in the spaces that we've already built. Just a little bit less surface level, really diving into research, figuring out more about these different products and things that we're doing. But I also think that there's plenty of opportunity to learn from other industries and crossover with other industries. Like cannabis and hemp are agricultural based plants, and there's really not much collaboration happening with the agriculture and fresh produce industry. So I'd love to see more hand holding between the industries and learning from each other.
Oh, that's a great point. The collaboration with those other industries, excellent. Thank you, Beth. I'm curious, any historical equivalencies that could guide us as the cannabis industry evolves? I'll throw that to Dr. Hust and Dr. Willoughby.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as more products are created and as the industry grows, there will be more refinement as to how these products can be marketed to adolescents and to users who may be more vulnerable. We see this in other industries, right? Smoking is probably the best industry for us to turn to see how this could evolve, and smoking in relation to tobacco. So, historically, like when I was growing up, you could have Joe Camel, you could market, products to children. People had toy trucks with Joe Camel put on them. We had candy cigarettes. All of the products were available, and there was not even a question as to whether or not this would encourage, children to want to smoke cigarettes. Those products are no longer allowed. The tobacco companies can no longer have those products. I'm not equating cannabis with tobacco. I'm simply suggesting that as the industry grows and matures, there will be greater criticism and observation of the products that it produces, and greater refinement as to how those products are communicated to potential users. I also think it's important to note that there are ethical and unethical marketers, and not all marketers are equal. And I really want to applaud Beth and Bess for engaging in this conversation today, and for some of the things that they've talked about representing their product ethically. And I think Beth in particular has made a couple of points where she talks about not only the legal ramifications, but making sure you understand the unintended consequences perhaps of your advertisements. And I think as the industry grows, And we no longer demonize cannabis use. It provide a space for marketers to really think about their products and how they want to market them ethically. And I look forward to that opportunity for marketers in the future.
Dr. Willoughby, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would just also add to that I think we can learn still from the alcohol industry as well, right? Similar examples that Stacey mentioned with the Distilled Spirits Council. And one of the things that I always tend to point out in my public relations class is that they have this code that they've self-created, right? They have their own marketing and advertising code that they follow. And I ask my students a lot of the time, why? Why would they do that? Why would they create their own code that they use? And it doesn't take long. Everybody pretty much picks up on the fact that, well, if they do it, maybe someone else isn't going to come in and tell them what to do, right? So by making your decisions up front and deciding how you want to be responsible in terms of marketing your product and creating an overarching guideline for that and what it looks like, I think you also keep control of that message in some ways that you might not if that weren't the case. So I think that's something that also can be useful.
Yeah, actually, it was interesting when you mentioned alcohol. That was what I was going to suggest as well, is like, we can really look to the alcohol industry. And it's interesting that, the alcohol industry can have things like birthday cake, vodka, and flavors that are delicious, but then there's so much regulation over a plant. And even, seeing in the space already, I've seen a lot of other advocates for the plant, influencers as they're called, brands, have spoken out, against overconsumption, because people are seeing that with social media and the algorithms, that sometimes they'll prioritize content that isn't the most responsible consumption. And so we don't want, we don't want that, if we're trying to change the image of this plant, we don't want to see people, using it irresponsibly.
Well, then in what ways, what's most promising in the way that we talk about cannabis today? What are you seeing, Bess? And then we'll open it up.
Yeah, I would say using it to enhance experiences, instead of, pouring a drink with, your friends, you're going to have a couple people over to share a blunt and sit out on the patio while you eat your cheese platter. We're using cannabis, topicals after your exercise, or me personally, I like to smoke weed and run. I don't know a lot of people that will take a couple dabs and go run 5 miles, but that's what I like to do. And so shifting that mindset of how we're using it, it's so many different ways to incorporate it to enhance experiences. It's not about creativity, for art, music, dancing. It's not just about getting high. And I think that, similar to what we've talked about earlier, it's like, if you're having this discussion with your kids from day one, that it's a plant for adults, or, it's a plant for adults to use responsibly, that it's going to deter them, because they're not going to have maybe as much curiosity, or, it's natural.
Now, is that similar to what you're seeing in the research, Dr. Hust and Dr. Willoughby, in terms of promising in the way that we talk about cannabis use?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I think really what we've seen in some of the messaging highlights exactly what Beth said, that we're seeing those appeals that are trying to promote the product as something that can be an experience for people. Stacey and I just completed a receiver-oriented message analysis, which asked people to look at some advertisements for cannabis and tell us what they're seeing. And we really noticed that those appeals were common in some of the messaging that we had looked at, right? People out on a camping adventure, sitting outside and having some while hanging out with friends around a bonfire, kind of that experience positioning, I think was really prevalent in some of those messages. Stacey, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, just the other appeal that we saw, that's not surprising, is we saw connections to romance and sex. And right, there's a whole movement of canisexual, and the idea of using cannabis to heighten the experience of sexual activity. And of course, it's still uncertain whether or not cannabis has sex as alcohol. And this is actually, I think, a really important component for future research, both from marketers, people in the industry, as well as researchers. We do not know how cannabis affects sexual decision-making and whether or not it has the same effect on consent as alcohol does. And so this connection between cannabis and sexual activity is perceived by many to be a negative association, but we don't know that it's a negative association actually. And so I think research needs to investigate that. But we see, those kinds of appeals in much the same way. We also see a smaller fraction of marketers connecting cannabis to sexual objectification of women and using, that old mantra, sex sells. In advertising, we see some marketers using that appeal. And I think that's more rare than it had been historically for other substances, in part because I think the cannabis industry, at least some marketers, are trying to do more mature and responsible marketing tactics.
Can I chime in on that? I would love to chime in on that, because that's actually been a big one is, I feel like especially in the cannabis industry, because there are so many women that have also been involved in like the growing, the curation of this plant, and it's a female plant. People don't want to see women sexualized to sell a product because they feel like almost if you have to use sex to sell your product, it's not a good product.
Mhm.
So it's been interesting to be a female in the space and beyond, just seeing that flip of, it backfires.
Mhm. Oh,
Yeah.
that's-
And we've seen, I've had clients come, to get PR services and they have that existing type of branding. And we've actually had to tell them, this is not going to work with your target audience. And it seems like they've started, searching after a certain type of segment that would answer to that type of marketing. But there are other ways to reach them because, as we talked about, people have all kinds of facets and interests, and reaching them with sexual content is not the only way to gain those consumers.
Mhm.
But overall, I think it's really promising, but I do think we're still in the very early stages of the undoing of negative propaganda and the general opinion of cannabis. We're still really early in that process, even though Washington has had legal cannabis for 8 or 9 years now. If you go to Wisconsin or Tennessee or Oklahoma, like you're going to see the same old types of attitudes and opinions about cannabis that we saw in the 1980s. So I think it's very different state by state, but overall it is really promising to see these shifts happening.
Mhm. Good. And what I hear across the board here is that more research is needed, right? Each of you have made that claim. And so I think that that's important to know that there's opportunity there, right? To examine different segments of this industry. So we do have an audience out here that include a lot of students, right? Who are looking for opportunities and really perhaps professionals who are looking for partnerships. So what's the growth potential specific to communication opportunities of the cannabis industry post-COVID-19? What could you provide as recommendations to these audience members?
Oh man. I mean, I got into the industry 6 years ago because my dad told me that cannabis was recession proof. And now, this many years later, it's also pandemic proof. And, I think that just as the industry expands, there's going to be so many more opportunities, brands. I believe last time I heard it was 167,000 people nationwide work in the legal cannabis industry. And that statistic was from a couple years ago. So, aside even just from the plant, you have to think about the ancillary brands, the grow equipment, the legal aspect. There's so many areas of communication that if you love this plant and you want to find out, if you want to help this plant and help this industry, there is a job for you. And so my recommendation for people who are looking to get involved, I interned at the Career Center when I was at Wazoo. So, and I learned a lot from it. And so if you want to really get involved, maybe look for an internship and, think about what kind of, communications you want to do, and try and just get your foot in the door with a company, write a great cover letter, explain what your skills are, what you can bring to the business, and apply, because there's no shortage of jobs out there. You can get it. If it means moving to a legal state, do it. You can do it.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Bess. I would say start influencing for yourself. Open up an Instagram handle, get a website. It's free. Start, sharing your experience with cannabis and creating your own content, because brands are going to want to see that you know what you're talking about and that you know what all of the different concerns and regulations are, and you'll have a total foot up when you're looking for a job.
Oh, that's a great piece of advice. I love that.
And I think something that you just noted, that both of you just noted, is it's not just going out and showing that you use the product, right? It's about that you understand the industry. And understanding the industry when we're talking about cannabis means understanding the rules and regulations and understanding both the healthy and potentially harmful effects. So I think that's also really critical. I'd like to think that in the Murrow College, we train students well to be in industries like this, because this is a very complicated industry. This is not for the faint of heart. I don't imagine that marketing for cannabis is easy. And I think it's wrought with difficulties and confusion and potential legal issues. And so the individuals who enter into this industry, they have to know what they're doing. They have to be really, really good at what they do. Otherwise, they're not going to last very long. The competition is pretty significant in the industry as well. So I think it's important that you go in prepared and that you know all there is to know about the product and you can talk about it responsibly. So I think, Beth, as you brought up a really great point for them to create their own channel and to start interacting in the industry, they want to do that from a very mature and responsible way from the start, so that they're taken seriously as marketers and not just as users.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Stacey is right. It is challenging and it is confusing, and every day is going to be different and you have to be prepared for that. But what I really feel is that the people in the industry have a passion for doing it. And, we appreciate the plant. We really want to see it succeed and be widespread in a responsible manner. So if you have a passion that you can tie to this industry and you want to pursue that, I would lead with that, because businesses are going to be looking for that as well.
Dr. Willoughby, did you want to add to that?
I think that pretty much everything was said. I think that's a great way for students to get started and think about things and move forward from there.
Great. We have generated a lot of interest from the audience. We have several questions in the chat that I'd like to address, but first and foremost, I'd like to provide kind of in summation what our experts provided us with today. That there's an increase in experience positioning in messaging, that marketers aren't created equal, right? That people do need to know the laws and the policies and really understand the effects of cannabis use. More research is needed. It's not a homogenized audience, which makes it a really challenging communication issue, right? And opportunity that's there. And I really appreciate this, that an overarching association is needed, right? To kind of help regulate or provide resources for individuals who are interested in entering the industry. I have to say a big thank you to each of the experts on our panel. I so appreciated our conversation today, Dr. Hust, Dr. Willoughby, Bess, or should I say Cannabis, and Beth. I'd like to turn our attention to our questions. We have quite a few from the audience, so I appreciate the engagement from them as well. Let's see here. Do you want me to ask them these questions, or is that? Yes, okay. So we have a question from Kara in the audience, and this is to everyone who feels equipped to answer it. How do you handle online advertising? Are you only able to target certain states because of the legalities involved?
We can't even do, I'm assuming, does she mean with like Google AdWords or like, because we can't even do online advertising with them. It's not allowed. They'll deny your request to advertise. So there are weird channels, like some of the porn sites you can advertise your cannabis content on. And I think you can advertise in states that aren't if you're like geo-targeting, you can still advertise in states that aren't legal, because who knows, maybe that person will want to come to your state for tourism. That's another one, cannabis tourism. But in terms of like paid advertising with Google and a lot of the ad platforms, you can't do advertising. So that's why with like social influencing, sponsored content, that kind of thing, it's so important.
Yeah, I think it does depend on your product as well. Like I know if it's, a university that has a cannabis certificate, sometimes that'll be accepted by Facebook or Google for advertising because they're not actually selling the cannabis product. They're selling like services or education. And then sometimes there's sneaky ways around it. Like you can create a landing page on your website that doesn't have any words like cannabis, hemp, or CBD on it. You will actually target to that landing page and not to like the main page of the website. So there's like a couple ways around it, and it depends on your product. But overall, Bess is correct that you really can't do that via Google or Facebook or Instagram.
That answered Kara's question. Thank you. Here's another question from Jackie. There are many people still in jail for crimes associated with possession of cannabis. Is there any way to give them a voice within the communication industry?
Yeah, actually, there's an organization called Last Prisoner Project, and they advocate on behalf of people that are still incarcerated for cannabis. There's a lot of industries, especially with the Black Lives Matter, just all the whole protests that started to happen last year. A lot of businesses started creating either philanthropic components of their business or donating a portion of proceeds. One of the retail shops I love in Seattle, they donate a portion of monthly sales to Last Prisoner Project. So there are a lot of brands who are using their business to give back and be demanding changes to legalization because as long as people are profiting off this plant, no one should be in jail for it.
Yeah, there are also organizations like Normal who are still working to free prisoners for cannabis possession. So if that's of interest to you, I would definitely encourage you reaching out to those associations and volunteering or supporting the businesses that have that as part of their mission.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do marketing agencies have more freedom to advertise than individual dispensaries?
I believe they do. Well, because like dispensaries, for example, with social media, because it's such an integral part of your marketing, you get shut down a lot. So also, if you're doing a dispensary, your marketing strategy is going to differ than if you're a brand. I feel like a lot of dispensaries, they do things like email marketing where they can push sales prices directly. You can't do that kind of stuff on social media. So it does differ.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question from Jennifer here. Does the industry have an interest in pharmaceutical development of CBD products? I know we touched on that briefly. Let's see. There is Epidiolex currently being the only FDA-approved CBD product. Is that the only one?
So actually, Idioplex, that's what I think is so crazy about it. The cannabis industry, in my opinion, doesn't want to go the route of big pharma. Big pharma spends $300 million a year to lobby politicians. They're so corrupt. Like, you don't need Idioplex that's a lab created synthetic when you can literally go and find a local sun-grown farm to produce the same thing locally. And so I think with rules and regulations going forward, it's why it's so important that you have brand diversity. You have the option to have your local farms because people say, oh, it's, there are similar pharmaceutical type products already on the market. Like I can go and get a suppository for my period. It's marketed just like would be a pharmaceutical product. Same thing with capsules or tabs or patches. Those are already available. So I would say creating an industry where we have more brands that we can create that kind of stuff. But in terms of getting big pharma, we don't want that.
I think it also might come down to a question of the target audience in some cases, right? And what they're looking for and not looking for. And for some people, they choose cannabis as an option opposed to in opposition to certain pharmaceuticals, excuse me. And so I think that for some, the positioning would also potentially be off if there was some sort of big push from big pharma, because partly what they're looking for is an alternative in some cases.
Yeah, but there are companies that are doing pharmaceutical research specifically for their products. You probably won't see them in the news or on social media because they're not working with social media influencers, and they're very science-based, and they wear lab coats, and that's very important to them. So those companies do exist. So if that's your interest in the market, I would encourage you to look for that type of company.
Good. And one last question here to round out our panel discussion today. Are there any skills that you had to learn or develop specifically for communicating about cannabis?
I would say You have to learn how to write the same thing in many different ways. So it's very similar to the science writing. You have to take something that is highly scientific, within very strict regulations, and you have to be able to break it down so that, every segment of the population is going to be able to understand it, or at least specifically your target audience. So I practice what I like to call word chameleoning. So you can kind of change how you write about something based on who you're talking to. So that's a very important skill for any industry and really any communications job, but definitely within the cannabis industry.
Yeah, that's great advice. For me, what helped me really learn how to communicate is with the cannabis industry, just like with any new industry, sometimes things don't always go as planned. So I was actually offered, my first job was offered a marketing job, and I found myself in a grow. So I found myself doing everything from cloning the plant to harvesting it. And it was being so hands-on, or even just seeing an actual plant, help me really describe more of the whole process, and then better communicate that to customers, similar to how Beth said, in many different ways. How many ways can you talk about a plant?
Mm-hmm.
It sounded too from some of your discussion that it also might be helpful in how you communicate with the people who approach you to do sales on their product, right? I think both of you, Beth and Beth, had mentioned having to come back and kind of say, well, this approach might not work, right? And so that side of communication, we don't always think about, but it's so important to be able to have those negotiations with the people who have an idea coming in of how they want their product marketed, but based on your knowledge and experience, what will really work.
That's huge. And that's something that people often forget working with NPR is your client came to you because they trust that you know what you're doing and that you know the industry that they want to play in. And so sometimes, early in your PR career, you might feel more like an order taker, like they came to me with goals and I need to help fulfill them. But you kind of learn a little bit more with experience that they're not always right. And oftentimes you really do need to kind of thicken up your skin and be prepared to tell them, based on my experience, I think you're going in the wrong direction and here's why. Just make sure that you have, something that you can back that up with in case they don't like that answer. But that's something you're going to have to do often in public relations and marketing.
I think hand in hand with that as well is being able to understand the effects of your messages. And so really being trained in the critical evaluation of message creation and understanding how your audience is going to understand your methods, or your messages rather, is going to be really key. And that literacy that both Bess and Beth have exhibited today is really important. The cannabis industry is going to change. It's probably going to be one of the hottest industries in the years to come. I loved how Bess pointed out that it's recession proof and pandemic proof. And it is, I think, probably one of the largest areas of growth in marketing and public relations. And so it's really important that the people who are staffing those positions and who are going to be contributing to this industry are science literate and media literate.
Mm-hmm. Good. And it's so fitting, since we're having a collegial conversation on cannabis, that we ended on the importance of messaging and evaluating the messaging and that research once again. So Dr. Hust, Dr. Willoughby, Beth, Bess, thank you again for such a dynamic conversation, and cheers to all of you in the audience. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.